Buenas tardes. Bueno, todos sabéis que la charla de hoy va a ser en inglés, pero os voy a comentar un par de cosas primero en español para todo el mundo que nos esté viendo por streaming. Muchas gracias por estar aquí un sábado más. Hacía yo ya un par o tres de sábados que nos veía. Hoy tenemos a Bill, al que ahora presentaré. Como sabéis, la semana que viene no habrá charla porque es Semana Santa y nos veremos la siguiente. Al final de todo ya os contaré cuál va a ser la siguiente. Well, and now, thank you, Bill, for coming here. Bill is a good friend from Students for Liberty. He is also a policy analyst for the Choice Consumer Center. You know, it's well, you can explain better than me what the Choice Consumer Center is. And you also write for many newspapers as The Times, Le Figaro, and Le Monde. So the floor is yours, Bill. Thank you again. And a big applause, please.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, well, thank you so much for having me. I much appreciate the invitation and the opportunity for me to speak on this topic, which is now very interesting because we're about a month away from the European elections. And I see the posters here in Madrid, so people are already campaigning. So this is going to be, of course, a very interesting topic. Now that Brexit is happening and a lot of movements, political movements, moving in a different direction in the European Union. So I wanted to take the opportunity to explain my view of things and to lay out to you the European case against the European Union. Now, just a little bit about me, just a bit more about me. I work as a policy analyst, journalist, political commentator, whatever you want to call it. And I write for different newspapers in German, French, and English. And I write daily, I publish regular columns. And what I'm most interested, of course, in is European Union politics and policy. So I look at what actual effects does European Union policy have on people, and how does that influence the politics of how we interact within this union. So here you find my personal info. But how exactly did I start off with wanting to do a talk about this in the first place? Because what I'm being told all the time is that we should support the European Union because we have European values. So I asked the question, what are European values anyway? And why am I supposed to support a certain political project because it's a European value? Who gets to define it? And what does that mean to be European? Is that cultural? Is it political? Or is it, as I might lay out, spoiler alert, in the end, a political proposal that tries to bully us into supporting this European Union? But before I do that, I like to play a little game with the room just to test your knowledge. And I'm sure you're very knowledgeable about the European Union, but just to get sort of a sense in the room and maybe lay out my case more precisely. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures of people who are in the European Commission, and you'll have to tell me who these people are. So, who's this? No, you're from Belgium, that doesn't count. Now you have your first clue. This is the commissioner from Belgium. Her name is Marianne Thyssen. She's in charge of getting everyone a job. Well, she's in charge of labor regulation, so that doesn't really mean one doesn't lead to the other. Yeah, she's in charge of regulating everything that leads to labor regulations. How can people be employed in the European Union? How can people move within the European Union? She's in charge of that whole dossier, and you've never, I'm sure, never heard of this person in your life. This gentleman, I'm sure that in this particular room, you might be aware of him. He's actually Spanish, I believe. He's Portuguese. Well, Carlos Moedas, indeed so. And he's in charge of research and innovation. And research and innovation, of course, so he's in charge. How are we going to innovate the European Union? Because the big question is, of course, how is it possible that the United States has a Silicon Valley and all these big companies, but we don't? So we got a civil engineer in charge of that. And again, he's not very known either. Next person. Anyone ever seen this particular person? This is Christos Stylianidis. He's from Cyprus. He's the commissioner in charge of humanitarian aid, and he's very, very qualified because he's a dentist. So perfect person for the job. The humanitarian crisis, of course, when he took office, is very important because we had thousands of people, of refugees coming into Europe, and we needed a constructive policy that works together. And what he managed to do is alienate the entirety of Central Europe by trying to introduce a quota system, which of course Hungary was very opposed to, and that's why we have this East-West division in the European Union right now. This person, Kamenu Vella, he's from Malta, the commissioner, and he's in charge of the fisheries policy. So all the fishing that goes on, if Spain has a disagreement with other countries as to where you're allowed to fish and where not, and who's allowed to get subsidies, he's in charge of that, and he's very, very qualified because he did architectural school. So again, perfect man for that job. This man, anyone? He should be the most significant commissioner because this is Phil Hogan. This is the commissioner from Ireland. He's in charge of the agricultural policies. So he's in charge of the common agricultural policy. That's 40% of the European Union budget. That's billions and billions of euros that he's in charge of in terms of how it is distributed to farmers. I'm going to get into what that exactly means, this policy, and why I think it's so destructive. And again, nobody's ever heard of this man in their lives. We don't know. If any politician in your country has this much power, he'd be on the news a couple of times, right? He'd be on a couple of talk shows. This man hardly ever appears in any interview. However, he's in charge of the biggest financial policy that we have in the EU. This person. Well, this is not a commissioner, this is just a stock photo of politician when you Google it, but if I had told you that this is a commissioner, you would have totally believed me. So the problem is, of course, that these people are not accountable because there's no direct way of communicating with these people. For most EU citizens, they don't have a means of communication because, well, they might not even speak their language. There's no public events that you can attend to talk to these people. Once in a while we do a citizens dialogue, but they happen in Brussels, and if you live in Bucharest, this is not really the place you want to go. I don't recommend a weekend in Brussels. It's never a good idea. So the question is, of course, how did we get here? How is it possible that we constructed a system that is so complicated, so detached from the average citizen, and still apparently is supported by everyone who is supposed to be reasonable? And everything started with this man. Now, this man you might be aware of if you paid attention in your history class. This is Robert Schuman. Robert Schuman was actually Luxembourgish, not our best expert, I would claim, but he took French citizenship under the Nazi occupation and became foreign minister of France. And on the 9th of May 1950, Robert Schuman laid out a plan. And his plan was, how do we get to the point where war on the European continent becomes not morally unacceptable, but economically non-feasible. And so he derived a plan that would make us economically dependent from each other, and he created the European Community for coal and steel, because those were very important goods, especially for the war machinery, as we've seen in Second World War. So what does Robert Schuman say? He specifically says, the pooling of coal and steel production should immediately provide for the setting up of common foundations for economic development as a first step in the federation of Europe, and will change the destinies of those regions which have long been devoted to the manufacture of munitions of war, of which they have been the most constant victims. He then continues, by pooling basic production and by instituting a new high authority whose decisions will bind France, Germany, and other members, this proposal will lead to the realization of the first concrete foundation of a European federation indispensable to the preservation of peace. Now, of course, there's a lot of talk about what did Robert Schuman mean by federation, because all the federalists keep telling me that when he said federation, he meant we should create a federal state. We should create one unitary state governed centrally, at least for all the policies that the European Union should be in charge of. But my question is when you say federation, especially if you say it in the 1950s, do you mean a federal state or do you mean an organic group? Which, in my opinion, was the interpretation that Robert Schuman took. When he said federation, he meant a federation of countries that get together to do things together in a unanimous way, as opposed to overriding states in the interest of the central authority. But since people keep claiming things about people that are dead, I thought I might as well do the same. And I read an article for City AM in London, and I said, Robert Schuman would be a Eurosceptic if he could see the protectionist EU racket today. And I stand by that. If Robert Schuman was alive today, he would be aghast. He would be appalled if he would see what economic policies we actually institute. He would say, what did you do to this project that I helped put in place? Robert Schuman also says, in taking upon herself for more than 20 years the role of champion of a united Europe, France has always had as her essential aim the service of peace. A united Europe was not achieved, and we had war. Now, the question is, of course, how united do we feel today? Well, when I see the headlines, I see Jean-Claude Juncker saying English is losing importance. Well, then a week later he said it was actually just a joke. Michel Barnier says the UK risks financial crisis if it diverges from EU regulation. Donald Tusk says that there's any hopes for future ties of the United Kingdom after Brexit is pure illusion. So, of course, how united does it really feel? How united are we as a European continent, or how united are we supposed to be as a club? And of course, my absolute favorite, Guy Verhofstadt. Guy Verhofstadt says, we need to get rid of unanimity also in matters of foreign policy. By the way, Guy Verhofstadt is not just any person. He's the leader of the European liberals and Democrats, or whatever liberals means in that sentence. And he's the chief Brexit negotiator of the European Parliament. He says, look to our incapacity today to react to Russian attack on British soil, still EU soil. The silence of Ms. Mogherini on this. Everyone has to agree before we react. That no longer works in the New World Order. So in the New World Order, no decision can be done by unanimity. We need to outvote countries. If the smaller countries are not in agreement, that shouldn't hold us back. When my country helped create this project, my country is the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, a very small country. In many European maps you can't even find it. We thought that all the countries were going to be treated equally, that we had the same voice as everyone else. But it turns out that according to those politicians, the big countries should be in charge. So, let me give you an example of how that works when they try to get rid of unanimity. There's a couple of areas in which the European Union has to decide unanimously in the European Council. So where every country has to agree if we make any policy changes. And one of them is tax policy. You cannot introduce a European tax, you cannot change harmonized European tax policies unless every country says yes. And for the last 20 years, the European Commission has not been a great fan of that system, because all these terrible Luxembourgers and all these terrible Irish and Maltese people have been holding the European Union back for introducing its own taxes. Because when they say harmonization, they don't mean harmonization to the level of Estonia. They mean harmonization of the level of France and Belgium and all these other terrible countries. Now, the European Commission asked the question, this is a memo that was released, I think it was about a month ago, and they say, how do we gradually improve decision-making in EU tax policy? Meaning, how do we win? And it lays us out a whole timeline, and it tells us, look how awfully inefficient we've been throughout the years. We haven't introduced a carbon tax, we haven't introduced a digital tax, and every time these countries keep holding us back. And it reaches the conclusion at the very bottom, this is a Commission document, that says, in this 26 years process, unanimity was used as a tool to create unnecessary delays and obtain concessions. Oh, how unfortunate. We have not been able to introduce new taxes and higher taxes because countries can oppose rules in the European Council. Now, when Robert Schuman talked about common agreements and common foundations for economic developments, he meant common as for the European continent, not for those that are simply member of an organization. For him, it was important that we see free trade and ultimately cooperation within the European continent as a value, not an advantage of joining the organization. Let me go back to this. He also says, this is all from the Schuman Declaration, he says, this production, meaning industrial production, will be offered to the world as a whole without distinction or exception, with the aim of contributing to raising living standards and to promoting peaceful achievements. With increased resources, Europe will be able to pursue the achievement of one of its essential tasks, namely the development of the African continent. Now, I think this is very interesting, because when we think about the cooperation, the economic cooperation with the African continent these days, we definitely don't think very positively about the European Union. And this is something very essential that I want to get into, one of the big topics, and that is trade policy, where I think really everything goes very, very wrong. And if more people were aware of this, we'd have more people opposed to the European Union. So the European Union practices protectionism. This is not a mystery. Economic protectionism in order to help European producers at the expense of those who are not in the European Union. And it does three things to achieve those. It has tariffs, it has the common agricultural policy, the CAP, and food standards. Now let me just see, so tariffs. Let's say you are a producer in any of the 54 African countries, and you want to export a good, let's say potatoes, to the European Union. The moment you try to get into the port of Antwerp or Rotterdam or any of the ports, they will say, there's a tax. Sorry guys, we have to put a tax on your goods. That's just because they're from abroad and ours are privileged. Now this is a classic example of protectionism. However, many in the European Union will say, well, we created the treaty that allows for free trade with 15 African countries, and it's called EBA, Everything But Arms, where you can export everything tariff-free if it's not arms and ammunition. You will soon find, for those who are very attentive, that 15 does not match the 54 countries on the African continent. So most countries on Africa are actually not included in that exemption. But even those who are, they will be hit by the common agricultural policy. The common agricultural policy is basically us saying we're going to give money to our own farmers so that they can continue being prosperous and they can deliver products that are affordable. However, not only do we subsidize our agricultural products for our own consumption, we even give them so much money that they are able to export. I was talking to a member of the European Parliament who was on a mission in Burkina Faso. And he went into a restaurant and he wanted to order a vegetable soup. And they said, sorry sir, the plane from France did not arrive today. And why is that? Because the vegetables in France are so subsidized that the producers are able to export by plane to Burkina Faso and sell cheaper than the local producers. So there's no way you can actually compete on your own market because the European Union can freely export into your country, and at the same time you can't export to the European Union. So we destroy local farmers in order to protect our own. Now, you could say, I like my local farmer, and that's a position you can have. Maybe you like going to your local farm and so on. But I believe you should pay the real market prices for that if you do so, and not have it subsidized by everyone else. Because I'd like to buy African products in my supermarkets, and I'd like to help support economies in Africa by doing so. However, the European Union does not allow me to do so. Food standards. Now, let's say you get over all of these hurdles. In one of the 15 EBA countries, you are able to actually produce so cheaply that you can compete with those farmers that are subsidized. But then the European Union says, oh, wait a second, we have food standards. So what happens every time that a new product comes in that doesn't match European standards, it's not allowed on the market. Now you would say this is reasonable because maybe the food that comes from Africa doesn't really match up with the expectations that European consumers have. In reality, however, these policies are made by the farmers that want to protect their own production. So they go to Brussels and they say, oh, this potato from Africa is actually very dangerous because of whatever. And a new regulation gets created that specifically targets these products, and then they are not allowed on the European market. And let me give you a very specific example as to how these policies combine and are very destructive. Two countries that were part of EBA, so tariff exempt, were Myanmar and Cambodia. Two countries that are big on rice production. And for the past years, they have been able to export rice on the European market. The rice, in my opinion, tastes better, also is cheaper. So what's not to like? These countries have development problems. We want people to be able to raise capital and be able to invest into new production methods. So we said, this is the best development policy. This was something that the European Union got right. Instead of just sending them money, we're going to allow them to export their goods. So what did farmers do? The farmers said, oh, now that I can export to the European Union, I'm going to invest. I'm taking up a loan, I'm buying new material, I'm getting a bigger farm, I'm buying more land. I have a loan, but I'm going to be able to pay it back because I can actually export to the European Union. Well, that's not until Italy, France, and Spain found out that, oh, this rice is actually cheaper than our own. So what did they do? They went to the European Union in Brussels and they said, listen guys, this is very unfair. These guys, they work for less and this is just not okay for our production. And on Monday, the European Commission said, we're going to consider this. On Wednesday morning, the tariff was in place. So a completely new tariff from one day to another implemented, which made it very, very difficult for these producers to export to the European Union. So what do you think is going to happen to these farmers that invested, that took up a loan, and now produce so much rice that they can't export to any country? We bankrupt people. First we give them hope and then we bankrupt them, just for the purpose of helping our own. And interestingly, for a very long time, this was why the left was against the European Union. If you listen to the 1975 debate in the Oxford Union, the British Socialist Party was against the European Union because it said it privileges the Europeans over our overseas territories. It privileges those who are white. That's why the left called it Euro-jingoism. They said this is a policy that helps white people instead of brown people, and were opposed for that reason. However, the socialists these days, they don't sound exactly the same because they have found out that you can actually get a lot of money out of the European Union, and suddenly they like it very much. Something else that Robert Schuman said. He said, a representative of the United Nations will be accredited to the authority and will be instructed to make a public report to the United Nations twice yearly, giving an account of the working of the new organization, particularly as it concerns the safeguarding of its objectives. So Robert Schuman said, this is a body that we're creating which has a lot of power. And you can't trust government with that much power, so you need oversight. His choice was the United Nations. Definitely not the organization I would have chosen, but that's well, we can talk about it. We can talk about that some other time. But what he believed is that the European Union was not going to be very good at implementing its own rules. However, that was never put in place. We don't have it today. The safeguard of the European Union is the European Union itself, respectively the European Court of Justice, into which I will go in a few slides. So, the Maastricht Treaty is the treaty that allows for economic stability. If you respect the criteria of the Maastricht Treaty, you're actually obligated to accept the euro as your currency. Now you will say the United Kingdom, Sweden and Denmark have opted out of this because they threatened that they would leave the European Union otherwise, so we made some exceptions for that. But generally, the Maastricht Treaty is what we want countries to actually achieve. And when we look at the list of the countries that don't actually respect the Maastricht Treaty, it's quite a long list. This is not updated. I believe there's some more countries in there. And what is, interestingly, actually my own country is actually respecting the Maastricht criteria. Now, in order to get accepted to the European Union, you need to respect another criteria called the Copenhagen criteria. The Copenhagen criteria says you need stability of institutions, you need to have a democratic system which is transparent and visible, and you need to have a functioning market economy. And when you actually look at the specifics of what the Copenhagen criteria say, and you adapt that to how the countries in the European Union function, and then you conclude which countries could actually still be a member of the European Union, or like which countries are actually in violation, you get, well, pretty much everyone. Yeah, so that's that. The European Union would probably not perform very well if there was an external assessment being made, which is why they don't do any. Let's go into the founders. So if you go on the website of the European Parliament, you find a couple of founders. So who actually founded this whole project? Robert Schuman is one of them. However, very interestingly, in the middle, you have Winston Churchill. And I had a couple of questions about this. Because when I go into the Parliamentarium, which is the interactive museum attached to the European Parliament, you walk in, and the first thing you see is an illuminated quote of Winston Churchill, in which he says, I believe I have this slide right here, he says, we must build a kind of United States of Europe. In this way, only will hundreds of millions of toilers be able to regain the simple joys and hopes which make life worth living. I thought, oh, interestingly, well, Winston Churchill was for the United States of Europe. How could that be? So if you do actually some research, you know that they cut out the quote, because in the next sentence, or in the longest speech, if you consider it, he says, we help, we dedicate, we play a part, but we are not merged with and do not forfeit our insular or Commonwealth character. Basically what Winston Churchill said, United States of Europe, good idea, we don't want to be part of it. Turns out that's actually what they got. So the question is, of course, we talk about European values, and we're supposed to support the European Union because of European values. So the question is, what do we actually mean by European values? And I would set these four as I think the ones that we can all, thank you, that we can all agree on. I think that most people would agree on that when people talk about European values, this is what we mean. We mean democracy, we mean the rule of law, tolerance, and solidarity. So let's just analyze these one by one and see what we get. Democracy. This is a chart, and this is simplified considerably, of the trilogues. Now, for those who are not into the system whatsoever, let me just briefly explain what the trilogues are. When the European Commission, which is the only organization in the EU that is allowed to produce legislation, when they produce a law, they send it to the European Council, which represents the states, and to the European Parliament, which represents the citizens. Now, these two analyze the document and say, we'd actually like to make some changes. Now, it turns out that these changes never match. I mean, the European Council rarely comes up with the same result as the European Parliament. So what they do is they organize trilogues. So together with the European Commission, the Council, and the Parliament, they organize talks, internal talks, in which they decide what is the legislation actually going to be, what can we agree on. These talks can have 3 rounds, but they very often now have about 20 rounds. 20 rounds of negotiation, in which are completely secret. You don't know who's a member of it. I met members of the European Parliament who are not even sure who of their colleagues is a member of this. And there's no report, no press release, no real sense of how did we get to the end result. Because when it says act adopted, you see that's the text that they actually came up with. What you don't know is which trade-offs were being made. So who said what to whom to get that sort of result? Because when you think that all of these countries are equal in the negotiations, you'd be very mistaken. Many countries receive concessions by doing trade-offs on a member state level. So let's say, for instance, France makes a tax proposal and they say, oh, we'd like to introduce a new tax on whatever. I mean, they have great ideas all the time. They rarely run out of ideas for taxes. And then they go to the European Council and they say, this is something that we'd like to do. And Spain says, nah, we don't like this. This is going to be bad for our consumers. France, during these type of negotiations or in the back rooms, they could say, listen, guys, we know you don't like this tax, but what we can do is we open a new factory of Airbus in Spain. 200 new jobs, 300 new jobs. Looks good on the upcoming election. And boom, suddenly Spain says yes to a project that you did not expect Spain to say yes to. And this is how the trilogue system works. There's a lot of trade-offs that we have no idea actually how this result came about. And this is considerably more intransparent than what happens on the member state level. And at least on a member state level, you can go to events by your local politician. You can talk about it. There's investigative journalists that work on this. This system is so convoluted that it's very, very difficult to understand how did we get to the end result. And by the time we get to the end result, it is too late. Well, it's like, oh, guys, we negotiated for 27 rounds. Well, I'm not going to object to the project now, right? I mean, it's too late to get involved. We already had so much democracy happening. One of my favorite quotes in that sense is from Dan Hannan, who says, there is a popular joke in Brussels that if the European Union were a country applying to join itself, it would be rejected on the grounds of being undemocratic. Because if you analyze the criteria itself, the EU could not join the EU. Now you will say, oh, Bill, listen, this is all fine and dandy. I understand your criticism. It's all a bit intransparent and undemocratic and sometimes even corrupt. But listen, we can be a part of this because we have consultations. Oh, I didn't want to click that. Because we have consultations. So you as an EU citizen can participate in consultations. They send you a questionnaire and you can go online and you can have yourself being heard. You can also go to events and express yourself. Now, to everyone, and I want to be challenged on this, happily, please do any consultation you can find. go online and try it out for yourself. Because I tried to do it for the digital tax. So France made this proposal of introducing a digital tax on big companies so that they are taxed in the country that the activity happens as opposed to the country where they actually have their headquarters. And I wanted to go into the consultation, and my answer, I wanted to give the answer that I don't want a digital tax. But that wasn't really that easy. What I found out is that throughout the questions, the only way for me to really answer the question was how we are going to introduce the tax. There was no way of really opposing the tax. And the way the questions were asked was so convoluted that in the end, I found myself a bit confused by my own answers. Because to me, it seemed that I was sort of cooperating with the whole system as opposed to saying no. And what was interesting is that we had the same debate of unanimity of tax questions. So the European Commission, as I told you before, wants to get rid of the idea that we all have to say yes to new tax proposals. So again, I participate in the consultation. I say, well, I'm going to try it out. I'm going to say, I'm from Luxembourg. My country's interest is to have unanimity so that we can veto tax proposals. 300 answers were given in. I analyzed the answers, and I did not find, a lot of people were against it. They could write comments. But the website then disappeared a week before the press conference that the European Commission gave. So when the consultation doesn't actually give the answer that you like, you make the website disappear, or you make no assessment of the answers whatsoever. Or what you can also do in the press conference, you can read some of the answers that you like. You can say, well, we consulted, and some of the answers were very positive. So another specific example. When the discussion was about TTIP, the free trade agreement with the United States, organizations and individuals were also called upon to give answers on a consultation. And ESIBE, the European Centre for International Political Economy, did a report in which they actually analyzed the answers. And here's what they say. During the ISDS, that's a specific system of litigation within TTIP, during the ISDS consultation, 97% of all replies were submitted by a small number of campaign groups. The responses were often identical, or at least very similar to one another. Prior to the consultation, a few anti-TTIP civil society organizations had set up easy-to-use online tools to facilitate participation in the consultation proceedings. And actually, interestingly, when you look at these organizations, many of them receive government funding. So sometimes these organizations are funded by the countries that want to oppose the agreement to go through in the first place. And we had a couple, we had a big fight over TTIP, especially because in Belgium, and they could not agree on it, and many organizations from Belgium were actually opposing this throughout and using these online tools to influence the consultation. So I don't feel very confident about the consultation process. Now, you'll say, okay, Bill, consultation is also not that great. The political system is not too transparent. Yeah, I get it. But we have the rule of law, and we have the European Court of Justice. And the European Court of Justice will look over the fundamental principles of what we want to do in the European Union. And I'm going to give you a very specific example of how you can see how the European Court of Justice actually finds decisions. Oh, that just slipped away. There we go. And my specific example, and you can look to different decisions, is the judgment of the court, very recent one, November 2018. This is the case number for all of those that want to look it up later. I can happily also communicate with you to send you all the documents that I'm talking about here. And what happened in this case, it's a very marginal case, you could say, was that in the European Union, there's a product called snus is illegal. For those of you who don't know what snus is a tobacco product, which is not actually smoked like a cigarette, but you put it under your lip and it has the same nicotine effect. The advantage of snus is that you don't get lung cancer. And that's why in Scandinavia, in many Scandinavian countries where this product is very popular, the product is used a lot and smoking rates are very low. And as a result, also many illnesses, pulmonary diseases are lower. Now, the European Union banned snus in 1992. Now, you can have a lot of theories as to why that is. I have quite a few, but let's not go into the specifics of that. And when Sweden joined in 1995, they said, the only way we're going to join the EU is if you allow us to have snus. Or one of them. It was one part of the negotiation. And so snus is illegal everywhere in the European Union, but you can legally buy it in Sweden. The biggest producer of snus in Sweden says, I'd like to sell my product everywhere in Europe. And it's very unfair that cigarettes, which are considerably less healthy for you, are legal and can be purchased everywhere, but my product, which is actually helping people quit smoking and is actually better for your health, or at least less harmful, is not allowed. So there's an inequality of how the law is applied. So they took to the European Court of Justice, and the European Court of Justice analyzed that, and the defendants, in order to keep the law in place, one of the countries was Belgium, another country was the United Kingdom, arguing that we should keep this ban on snus. And the court says two things, which I think is, it doesn't really relate necessarily to this case or this product, but the answer is so telling about how the court sees the world. So it says two things. First, it says, tobacco products for oral use remain harmful to health. Okay. Are addictive and are attractive to young people. Further, as stated in paragraph 26, such products would, if placed on the market, represent novel products for consumers. In that context, it remains likely that member states may be led to adopt various laws, regulations, and administrative provisions designed to bring an end to the expansion in the consumption of tobacco products for oral use. So what the court says here is that if this product was legal, people would use it. It seems quite obvious to me. And then some governments would maybe not like the fact that people use these products and would legislate on their own. But then it continues, and here's where it gets really interesting. Moreover, as regards more particularly the claim by Swedish Match, which is the company, that the permission given to the marketing of other tobacco and related products demonstrate that the prohibition on the placing on the market of tobacco products for oral use is disproportionate, it must be recalled, this is really important, that an EU measure is appropriate for ensuring attainment of the objective pursued only if it genuinely reflects a concern to attain it in a consistent and systematic manner. Now, this is a lot of legalese. What this means, what the court says here, and it says this in every ruling, it even backs up this judgment with other rulings that it did in the same fashion, is that the problem of legalizing snus would be that we try to reduce tobacco consumption. Now think about what that means. There's a company that says this law is unjustly applied to us in comparison to other products. And the court says, we get that, but the policy of the European Union is to reduce tobacco consumption, and we cannot allow a new product to come on the market. This is important. The European Court of Justice doesn't defend the principle of the law. It defends the policies of the European Union. The European Court of Justice is there to defend the political priorities of the European Union. And it does this over and over again. It is not here to defend your rights. It is here to defend the interests of the European Union. Now, tolerance and solidarity, we can talk about this, and I think specifically in the Brexit negotiations, with a lot of declarations that we hear about how the Brits are not European anymore, how they're all racist and anti-immigrant. That, of course, shows a lot about the tolerance and the solidarity that we show within the European Union, but let's not delve too much into that. But if we have European values, let's just invent some more, and I will predict that these will come up eventually. We could say that centralization is a European value. Consumer protection is a European value. Welfare payments or higher taxation. Everything that you want, you can just say, it's actually a European value, and that's why we should have it. By the way, how am I on time? Just for...
You have 20 minutes.
Oh, 20 minutes. Oh, fair enough. All right. Not sure I'm going to need that much, but I don't want to bore you. But yeah, this is my prediction. This will come up eventually. But let's say, I think after that, they'll have some more European values. Why not say a European president is a European value? I mean, if you want to feel European, got to have a president, right? We need to be like the United States, so we got to have one figure that represents us all. Or prefects instead of states. So let's move away from the idea of a federal state. Let's have a centralized state, the way that France wants it. We centralize everything in Brussels, and the prefect comes to Madrid and says, so Brussels says this is how you need to implement it. And no national governments anymore to have any competencies, no way of actually easily removing it, less and less power from local communities. And I would say, go back. It's a trap. Because we go further and further down this rabbit hole. Now, interestingly, some of the people who wanted the European Union to integrate and centralize even more have sort of caught on to this problem. When you read the European Federalists today, they say, 15 years ago we thought that the Eurosceptics were dangerous because they wanted to leave the European Union. Today they are dangerous because they want to stay in the European Union. The likes of Kaczynski in Poland or Salvini in Italy, their intention is not to leave the European Union. Their intention is to form the European Union in their image. That's what they actively do. And the European elections are going to show this. They are trying to cooperate, they're trying to have a large group in the European Parliament, have a lot of political influence, and push their policies on the European Union. So instead of countries saying, I want to be out of that, that's just too much power, the people who are most prone to want power have found out, oh, this is a great tool to implement my policy prescriptions. And this is what I say to people who are fans of the European Union, and I'm sure there are some or many here this evening, is that the question is not necessarily what does this project do right now and the powers it has, and does it do something I like? But the question is, how much power should the government have at all? Because what you find very quickly is that if you give power to a political institution because it does something now that you like, you might find yourself in a minority very soon. And the people you least wanted to be in power will be. So when I talk to people who say, I want a European army, and they picture somebody like Macron being in charge, I said, okay, so what if Marine Le Pen is in charge of the European army? Do we want that? Do we want somebody like Geert Wilders to be in charge of the European army? Are these the kind of people that we picture? Because if you create that power, somebody eventually will have it. The problem of the Weimar Republic in Germany was that it was not watchful of having constitutional protections against the creation of the Third Reich. The problem of government is that if you allow too much power to be seized, it will eventually be seized by the worst people. And this illusion that now we had so much time of peace and that authoritarianism is impossible in Europe is just nonsense, especially because we keep talking about it. What I find interesting is that at the same time we say that authoritarianism is on the rise in Europe, we constantly hear this, but at the same time we create a political structure which has as much power as it never had before. So do we actually finally understand this risk that we are creating? Because I'm not against the European Union because I take the position of the Le Pens and the Salvinis of the world. My problem with the European Union is too much centralization. Because too much centralization means, one, there's a lot of power centralized and that is dangerous, and two, all the mistakes that we made will be generalized mistakes. Because what we see right now is that countries implement a policy, it doesn't work, they get rid of it, and then they come back to Brussels and say, oh, let's do it all together. That way we can't find out the differences. The beauty of Europe is that we practice different policies in different countries and we see what works and doesn't work. France clearly doesn't work. Estonia does work, because Estonia made some really rational choices after communism and said, let's have a flat tax system and very low regulation. If you live in Estonia, your tax declaration is 1 page. You don't even need an accountant. In France, it's a Bible. And I know because I had to deal with it. And so those differences can be singled out. The problem is that if these countries say all of our bad policies are going to be generalized, then we don't figure out what works and what doesn't. Some people are catching on to this. This is the Prime Minister of Denmark who says that the European Commission just presented a budget the size of 28 member states, but we are only 27 member states 28 to finance it. A smaller EU budget, a smaller EU should mean a smaller EU budget. So that we're seeing that the Scandinavian countries are actually more and more skeptical. Finland is going to be in charge of the next presidency of the European Union. They said that they don't want the European budget to increase. They don't want to spend more money. So slowly some politicians are actually catching on to this because there is criticism. And the criticism doesn't only come from the far left and the far right. The criticism comes from people who say, I don't mind this European project, but I think it goes too far. We had some good starting principles, but we moved away and we regulate everything. And the problem with regulating everything is that people get upset and they get frustrated. And when they get frustrated and they criticize the EU, all we say is, well, they're racist and they are bigots and they don't understand our great visions. And those people are going to be turned to the far right and the far left. I want to prevent that. And I want to prevent that by disintegrating the European Union. But since we're making up European values, I'll make some up on my own. Limited government is a European value. Private property is a European value. Localism is a European value. And free markets is a European value. I mean, if you disagree with any of those, you must be against European values, right? It's an easy catch argument. We keep making it, and I think it's very, very disingenuous. What I like to see is that when you argue with people who say, well, are you against European values? Tell people, what are European values? And why is my vision of a Europe that cooperates really so difficult to understand, and why would it be so bad for this continent? Before I get to that, let me just have a little conclusion. I'm from the #2 country of the biggest support for the European Union. Luxembourg has, according to polling by the EU, so we'll have to put that under perspective, 85% of support. The only other country is Ireland with 87% of support for the European Union. I'm from a country that suffered greatly on the Second World War. We were invaded by Nazi Germany, and we were freed by the United States. And I'm always being told that my grandfather, who was drafted forcefully by Nazi Germany, would love the European Union and would agree with my system. And if I want to honor his memory, I should support the European Union as it is today. Well, anything that people who opposed tyranny in Europe did, anything they did to oppose this regime was not to create an intransparent, unaccountable political system. What they wanted was freedom. And freedom is what we should be focused on. We should be focused on a system that allows countries to compete and find the best solutions. And when we have the European Union as it is right now, I don't believe we can reach that type of liberty and of freedom. And I believe that anyone who believes in values of solidarity and cooperation and free trade and giving people in other areas of the world a chance to use the market for their benefit, all of those people should oppose the European Union. So I thank you very much for your attention. And I'm happy to tell.
People who defend the European Union, they say that it's a good way to redistribute the money from the richest, wealthiest countries to the east, who are the poorest. Is it working? Is this system helping the former communist countries to develop?
Well, if you ask people in those countries, they don't actually think that that is the case. If you go to a country such as Croatia, which has recently joined the European Union, all the people there believe that this has actually not helped their country whatsoever. Because what we did is really transfers. We send a bunch of money and we said, oh, now here you can renovate your tunnels and your roads and your bridges and your airports. But what we didn't do is we didn't create a sense of understanding as to why we do this. And now that these countries are developing, we say, well, the money ran out, we need it for new countries that need to join. And countries such as the Czech Republic ask themselves, then now that we've renovated all the roads and so on, we need some free trade. We need to actually create that prosperity. And then they go to Brussels and they say, the Czech Republic's, I live in Prague right now until the end of the summer, and then I'm going back to Brussels. The Czech Republic's second trading partner is China. And they say, why not have an agreement with China? And then the French say, yeah, but the Chinese, we don't really agree with the way they treat workers. And well, essentially what it means is they don't want the competition. But a country such as the Czech Republic would love that exchange. And so we do have different values. And maybe France doesn't want to have a free trade agreement with China. And that's fine. That's to their own disadvantage. But the fact that we pulled a trade policy together in one place is what countries in Central and Eastern Europe now object to and what they see as being a negative thing. So I don't believe that these transfers have created a sense of community or development. I think these countries have developed because they had better economic policies, because they recognized that not only was communism very bad, but that free markets were great. and that it helps people rise out of these situations. I mean, the fact that the Czech Republic now has an unemployment rate of 2% is not because of transfers from the European Union, it's because they actually have a regulatory system which is very advantageous to creation of businesses.
Well, thank you, Bill. I want to ask you, now finally Brexit happened. Well, we actually don't know, but how do you think, or how do you imagine the distribution of powers in the Council?
Well, I always say that the worst part of Brexit is that we lose one of the most rational countries in the European Union. The UK was actually very helpful in many aspects, to bring people back to reason. I think many of the very, very good bureaucrats, even in the European Commission, were Brits. And now they're being replaced by a bunch of French socialists who are fanatics. And that's the reality of how some of these departments work. There's some very good departments in the European Commission, and there's some very bad ones. And you see sort of where people come from as to where they make the decisions. How is that going to affect the political changes? Well, if you take the arguments of the people who are in Brussels right now, the EU officials, they say, oh, actually, this is not too bad. I mean, the UK is gone. Now we can create even more tax and even more harmonization. The day after Brexit, many EU officials said, well, now finally we can implement all the rules that the UK has been blocking us from doing. Now, the question really is are smaller countries and countries that are now more Euro-realist and skeptic going to stick together and oppose this further integration, or are we losing with the UK an actual break to this process? And that's tough to say. I don't know how it's going to turn out. I mean, we don't even know how Brexit is going to turn out, because apparently it's now on Halloween, that Brexit is going to take place October 31st. So the dynamic will really be found out after the European elections and what the political priorities are. But in my opinion, the one bad thing about Brexit is that we have lost a valuable partner in this discussion.
Okay, I want to first thank you for this talk. When you talk about the CAP, you said that the EU farmers have benefits from external farmers, but from my experience of my own family, this doesn't even happen, because in Galicia at least, the farmers have a top of milk production. If they pass this top, they must pay and they are punished. So this policy doesn't even happen. Doesn't even help the EU farmers. Only benefits some farmers.
It depends. It also depends on what type of farmer you're talking about. If you have a smaller farm, you're in a different situation than a larger one. Actually, interesting. The two biggest benefactors from the common agricultural policy are the Queen of England and Frankfurt Airport, because they have the largest amount of land that they don't use. So that's how the system works. Now, in your specific example, I'd have to look at it, but larger farmers and larger companies actually benefit considerably more from that, because they can move things around if they are under a larger structure. And then if they move things around, then they can easily also use exports. There is essentially no other explanation as well when it comes to exports to Africa. I mean, unless you tell me how exactly an African producer would be absolutely unable to produce cheaper than a French one, I don't quite understand, because the French farmer has considerably higher labor regulations and so on and so forth. And the easiness with which they can export, of course, helps that. Now, the commissioner, when asked about this problem, their response is, well, Africa should just have their own protectionism. They should introduce their own tariffs. So the solution is always, well, the bad policies that we have in Europe, they should just reproduce them. Then maybe it can work. But I'm happy to look at the specific example in more detail. Yes.
So, Bill, on this topic, I want to know your opinion about the common currency and the paper of the European Central Bank on all of this.
I'm generally not a fan of central banks in general, so the argument to say that if you just get rid of the European Central Bank and then we have a national central bank that's better, I'm against central banks in general. I don't think it's a system that we should have. The central banking has been at the biggest problems, economic problems that we've had in all of human history. It has made world wars possible that otherwise wouldn't have been financeable. So in that particular aspect, I don't have more criticism towards the euro than I have to other countries. Now, the problem with the euro is, of course, that the economies are different and the expectations toward economies are different. And Germany has been a large benefactor from the system in comparison to countries such as Spain and Greece. But ultimately, I mean, the solution to me is to get rid of the ECB and every national central bank, and then institute a system which is free and run by different companies or different cryptocurrencies or whatever. But I've been working on the specific talk on the euro, so hopefully I'll have that narrowed down in the future to go more into detail.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Bill. I think it's been very interesting to hear all of the ideas, and I especially liked your own values approach to it. So that was nice. My question has to do with the values and the idea that no matter, there are no political orders that actually stand up to the values, not even at the nation state, and I think that always tends to happen because values are always something that, when applied to reality, are always hard to come by. No? But if you start at smaller political units like Italian city-states, then we get that big transfer into the nation state, and now we've done this huge gouge into the European organism. But I wanted to know what you thought about. Do you think that it's just there's no way for us to get around what values we want because there's not a political demos in Europe, and I don't want it to be personally. I don't think we'll get there. But what do you think about that? Do you think there's any way such a big institution can have and really live up to its values?
Right. I mean, I'm generally not a fan of the pronoun we, because I never really know who that's supposed, like where that authority comes from when somebody says we. Oh, we should do this, we should do that. I never really understand how I was moved into that group. So when people talk about values, it's usually just an easy excuse, as I explained. Can a big institution like that, if it had genuine values or good values such as mine, could it implement that? And my answer is always like, even if the EU was this free market haven that I would think it maybe could be, I would still be opposed to the power structure as is. Because you have two types of politicians. You have the opportunist and you have the fanatic. And I much prefer actually the opportunist to the fanatic, because the opportunist just wants to get fame and money, while the fanatic actually wants to do considerable changes and make everyone live according to their view. I think the general problem is not necessarily about which values it is, but the idea that somebody is actively working towards implementing values as opposed to creating monetary value or value that actually is useful to other people. Just think about a system that we developed. We developed a system where people go to Brussels and they have a great idea as to how the whole continent should function. And in their little office, they implement policies and move money around and create laws that make that happen. And I think it's the problem of knowledge, as Hayek explains quite accurately, is that you can never get that much knowledge in a centralized authority to make that work. So even if you had the best values in the world, if it was that centralized, you don't know enough about it. I mean, what does a person who works as a bureaucrat in Brussels really know about the rural areas of Romania? It is really difficult to figure that out. And you can do as many polls and studies and so on, but the feelings and the motivations and the aspirations of those people will never be something, in my opinion, that you can realistically achieve. Now, you can talk about it and you can have ideas about it, but I don't want anyone to have that much power. Now, if power is to exist, I believe that it should best be had at the local level. I think where you have local communities and your municipality and your local councillor that you can meet on a daily basis, that are part of your neighborhood and your friends, where you can actually have somebody that you can talk to and democratically remove if you don't like them. I think that's a better system. It needs to be local, and just because we have internet and phone calls as we like doesn't mean that we have gotten rid of that gap in terms of distance as to how politics works. And that, to me, that's the real danger of having a centralized system with values. Yes.
Okay, so as a Eurosceptic, just as you, right? I'd like to get to know your opinion about the upcoming or the mainstream alternative right parties in Europe, such as the United Kingdom Independence Party, Geert Wilders, or Alternative für Deutschland, right? Do you think those parties are the real solution for freedom in Europe, or do you think they are such as the wrong way to look at right now, or whether you think that's the right way to go in Europe or not?
I do not. I'm just because there are some Nazis who agree with me doesn't mean that I think I'm going to endorse them to run the policies. Nazis believe mostly actually in free expression, and so do I. But that doesn't mean I have to endorse them to run politics. There are some good Eurosceptic movements in Europe, and there are some politicians that I believe are genuine and believe in free markets and believe in the problem that the European Union constitutes for the same reasons that I do. But many of these parties are indeed very problematic, and as I explained, when it comes to Salvini and so on, they aren't Eurosceptic in the sense of wanting to leave the EU. They want to come into the EU to change my life in their image, and that I think is very worrying. So I always tell Eurosceptics, don't team up and don't be too excited about all these far-right movements, because they are not going to be what you expect them to be. They are very power-hungry and power-lusting as well, and those are not going to be the solution. Now, it would be, of course, great if I just said, okay, these parties are exactly what I envisioned, because I could show I have a lot of support behind me, and oh, look at all these people that oppose the European Union. But I say we need to oppose the European Union for the right reasons, and I think we need to be intellectually consistent and say that these parties, when it comes to Alternative für Deutschland and other the Le Pens of the world, they are very, very interventionist. They are very often bigoted. They don't believe in free exchange between free people, and so no, they are definitely not saviors in that instance. Now, I do like the fact that some of the stuff that they do brings the European Union to a halt in many aspects. Some of the policies move much slower because of these parties, and I think those troubles are good because the less laws they make, the better. But they are definitely not a solution.
Well, I don't think Geert Wilders is a Nazi. His party is called Party of Freedom. And I wanted to ask you, because I think Europe has brought to you, the European Union has brought a lot of benefits, like freedom of exchange, people, money, inflows and outflows of money between countries, and brought a great deal of prosperity for the whole of Europe. I know Europe has problems, like a big taxation, pressure in terms of legislation, etc., which is holding us back. I agree with you on that. Or for example, legal problems like Belgium doesn't want to give us Puigdemont. But I remember when they were thinking about making Turkey part of the EU, and they stopped that project because of all the problems with terrorism, etc. So I thought of maybe bringing Vietnam to the European Union. It's a country we are already making business exchange. For example, the telephone manufacturer BQ went there to manufacture their phones. It's a Spanish company. Mm. And maybe not because it's not a European country, but creating agreements with this country, for example. What's your vision? Because in my opinion, Europe, the EU has to be fixed rather than dismantled. Do you think it should be dismantled or fixed?
Okay, there were a lot of things in there. I'm not sure if the first comment was sarcastic or not, as to the Geert Wilders and calling himself the Freedom Party. I mean, North Korea is called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I wouldn't call it very democratic either. So what's in the name is not necessarily what it is in reality. But I would, and on the second part of your comment, maybe I would throw it back to you. So what would the European Union have to do that you would oppose it? Like, at what point, at what policy, like how far would they have to go in terms of bad policies where you draw the line and say, okay, this is enough?
When, for example, the EU reaches a state that is even worse than being on our own. Because when Spain has been on its own, our politicians have devalued the currency, committed a great amount of corruption, even more than now. So, in my opinion, we are better off inside the EU if it gets fixed. But it has to get fixed, obviously. So,
right, it's a pragmatic reason for that, because you say the project as it is right now is better. So pragmatically,
yes, another reason for having the EU is because we are competing with big players such as the US China, so on and so forth. So if we are on our own,
I'd love to respond to that because I get that argument at least once a week at this point.
if we are on our own, we can't compete.
Right. Iceland has a free trade agreement with China. Iceland is an island of 300,000 people. Switzerland is able to compete with the world. Singapore and Hong Kong are able to compete with the world. It's not because they're part of a big structure. The Soviet Union went bankrupt. It was the biggest country in the world. So the structure is not what you need. You need the right policies. And if you say for pragmatic reasons, you would rather be a member of the European Union because Spain was worse before, then take some long-term views and understand that what has led Spain to economic problems is exactly what the European Union does right now. Because the same people are in charge with the same philosophies. It may take a longer time because there's some resistance from countries such as Luxembourg and Ireland and so on. So it might take a longer time overall, but in the end, it comes to the same result. And the problem with that is that when it comes to the same result on such a large scale, it comes crashing down way harder. If you have a crash with a small plane in comparison to a big plane, the damage is much bigger. So to me, saying pragmatically, I'd like to be a member of the European Union, just in that case, let's say Spain were to leave the EU, then say, well, Spain is just going to adopt all the policies that were good in the European Union. Take the best practices and take the lessons out of it. Now, can we fix the European Union? Now, fixing the European Union is something that many people go to Brussels in order to achieve. And they find themselves in this convoluted structure of different regulations, different interests, and eventually they get lost in it because there's so many topics. Just to give you a perspective, on a voting week in Strasbourg, when they vote on the amendments and so on, they vote by at least 4 votes a minute. Can take up to 2 hours. There's so many votes being done that the parliamentarians have absolutely no clue what they're really voting on, apart from the few ones that they like. So all these parliamentarians that you're going to vote in May, for about 98% of the votes have absolutely no clue what they clicked, because the party group gave them a list and they say yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. Some of them get it wrong. Actually, there's hundreds of MEPs that actually click the wrong button, and they make those decisions. So if you want to go there and say, okay, now I'm going to change the system from the inside, where half of these jokers don't even know what they're voting, I'm a bit skeptical. The system has become a bit too large. To me, it's like saying, well, the mafia is so bad, I'm going to join the mafia and change the mafia from the inside. And I'm a bit pessimistic about this. And I believe, well, we have now the first country leaving the EU. We'll see what that means over time. The UK already has an agreement in place now with Switzerland. I believe that countries can work together and find solutions. But believing that we need to keep this rigorous system that we've had for decades now, and that there's absolutely no alternative to it, doesn't give enough credit to the ingenuity of policymaker, in my opinion.
I would like to know, excuse me. I would like to know if you think, what do you think? No, sorry. What is the closest European political party that defends the Bill Bird's European values? What is the closest one? If there is any.
Well, I wouldn't say that there is any. There's a couple of politicians in the European Conservatives and Reformist group right now, including people such as Dan Hannan, that was in one of the quotes, that to me are very free market and really good politicians on that end, if there is such a thing as a good politician. But ultimately, there's no party as such. And I would be very skeptical if there was, because to me, free market ideas are very difficult to keep in a party line because there's so many interests involved. So the quick answer is no, there's no such party. But that doesn't mean that on a national level, in new elections, you might not have a party that actually is very genuinely free market and that you could vote for. I know that a lot of libertarians in many countries, SFL members, actually have been standing for elections. If you have an SFL member who stands for election in any, be it municipal or European elections, I recommend you vote for them because they know about the ideas and they are straightforward. So is there a general case against voting? Not necessarily. I think you should analyze the policies and look what they actually want to do and then make your decisions on that basis. But right now there's no party, no.
I have the view that the negative vote about the European Constitution was a moment when the EU citizenship, the EU people saw the extraordinary complexity of the European rules and rejected that. Don't you think that that's a good step towards simplifying of the system?
The results of
the results, the rejection of the European Constitution.
Well, as we saw, the rejection didn't do very much. You know, I mean, even in my country, there was a referendum, and Jean-Claude Juncker, then Prime Minister in Luxembourg, said, "I'm going to resign." And he was a very popular politician. "I'm going to resign if this is a no vote." So in the end, 55% of people said yes. It was rejected in the Netherlands and in France, and then we glossed over it. We changed it into the Lisbon Treaty, and then we did it anyway. I think it's it's a monumental example as to how it works when we have referendums, and we see it in the UK right now as well. It's definitely a good illustration. I think that's the reason, by the way, that treaty changes are going to be very rare in the next years to come, because they know that many countries would reject it. Countries such as Denmark are historically very Eurosceptic. The Czech Republic is the most Eurosceptic country in the Union right now, with only 39% support. Italy is very Eurosceptic. And so I think treaty changes are not going to come up, but it remains a very good example as to how they pursue their policy objectives, because ultimately we got the European Constitution. The people said no in 2005, and we still got it. It's called the Lisbon Treaty, and it's the same thing. So yeah, that's how we see how it works.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for your talk. I've really enjoyed it. And my question is, do you believe that all these bureaucrats that you have shown us on your slides are that far away from the reality that they truly believe that with their decisions they're actually helping European citizens, or are they just psychopaths who act and think in their own interest?
Well, there's different dynamics, and I know people who work in the European institutions as well, who are part of this policy-making process, and there's different kinds of people. What I found very interesting is when somebody who worked in the European Commission told me, if I want to get up the ladder, if I want to get a higher position, I need to make a new rule, a new proposal, a new policy. Nobody gives you any credit for anything you got rid of or anything you didn't do. So, for instance, there were bureaucrats and politicians that proposed that we should give a free Interrail ticket to everyone in the European Union who turns 18. And somebody got that project and they approved it. It cost millions of euros, and somebody was promoted over that because great, they pushed it through, they showed that they had the capacity to push through a policy. So there's a lot of bad incentives involved, and the bad incentive is, of course, that if you want to be known as a bureaucrat, you need to make a new rule, and you don't get any credit when you get rid of it. But many of them are also fanatics. Many of them come out of places such as the College of Europe in Bruges, where they are being told that they are going to be the new EU heroes. If you go to any EU-funded youth projects, that's what they're going to tell you. You are the ambassadors of change. You're going to stand up to all the populists, and you need to make a lot of new rules to centralize the EU in order to prevent that. So there's a lot of people who genuinely believe that, and some of them are opportunists who get bad incentives. Lumping them all in one category would be difficult. I think there's a mixed problem, but all the problems narrow down to how the EU functions in general. Yes. Any other questions?
I would like to ask you about you and the Consumer Choice Center, you try to follow the European policies, right? Mm-hmm. How hard is it to find them? Because, for example, I try to check some votes or some things about the European Parliament, and it's really hard. And sometimes it's not too transparent, like the policies or what they are working on, and how has been your experience following these policies?
You have to focus on a specific topic because there's too many topics to follow all at once. I mean, some of them go really into detail over months of negotiation. If you look at the copyright directive, a lot of you have heard about Article 11 and Article 13. Many people believe that this is something that came up 6 months ago. This has been a negotiation for 20 years in the European Union. So if you really want to understand how we got from point A to point where we are now, you need to read a lot of documents. So it is a lot of trouble. And convincing politicians, maybe that's not part of your question, but it's also part of what we try to do, is that there is a big unawareness problem. As I told you before, very often they're not unaware of what they're actually voting on, and a lot of it is actually making them aware of what the problem is and what the best practices, in our opinion, is of how to achieve better policies. So it is a huge struggle. I spend a lot of jolly good time reading directives and opinions and amendments and all of that. It's best times of the day.
So thank you so much for your talk. And the place you work at, the Consumer Choice Center,
yes.
Do you provide or you elaborate any kind of analysis related to the ECB or monetary issues? Or
we don't work on monetary issues, no. Just about the Consumer Choice Center, this is one of the things I do. I also write a lot of political commentary pieces. In the Consumer Choice Center, what we try to do is look at EU consumer policy and how it affects consumers like if it regulates their behavior and their prices and so on, and try to gain support of politicians who are willing to have more reasonable policies. This sort of gets into the nitty-gritty. It's outside of the philosophical debate. It's more inside of the actual policy debate, what I work on. But I see a lot of things that help me understand even more every day how the system is not ideal, let's say.
Another comment that 2 weeks ago, here was Daniel Hannan's advisor. He says that one of the things is usually people don't look at the European Union when they have troubles. Like they always look at the national government, national level, but never to the European Union. But some of these laws are made by the European Union. You that have been in Brussels. There is a way to make pressure to these people to say, hey, you are doing bad laws or... Yes?
That depends on the rule. There's this idea, like when you criticize the European Union, many people tell you, oh, listen, your national government was involved in making those rules. So if you have any criticism, go to your government. And that increasingly is not the case anymore. Most decisions are now done by a qualified majority. So it is very possible that in your country, all of the elected members of the European Parliament of your country voted no. All of the diplomats in the European Council said no. In the meetings and in the working groups, they said no. Your Prime Minister or President said no, and you still have to implement the rule. So, and at that point, when you ask me, where do I go to protest this and to oppose it, I can't really tell you. Because if you go to Brussels and you go to the Commission says, we don't make any rules, it's the Council. And you go to the Council says, this is the Parliament, they made those amendments. And you go to the Parliament and they say, well, the amendments were made in trilogue, we don't really know who made them. And eventually you're so confused that you don't really know who to protest. And that's how people end up in voting for parties that are very extreme. Because they don't really understand how the system works. And yes, I mean, we have the situation right now. The Czech Republic was against the amendment to the European Firearms Directive of 1991, which was now amended in 2015, which establishes that shotguns have to be banned and we have to have a European registry for firearms. The Czechs were against it, and they still have to implement it right now. And so now the whole question is the Czech Republic actually going to implement it into national legislation? And what happens if it doesn't? Because then it will be sued and so on and so forth. So yes, there is power in Brussels that decides over all the people that you voted for, might have voted for. So that's the reality of how it works.
Another question? No? Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Bill. It was an amazing talk. I will see you in 2 weeks on the 27th of April with Alejandro Jenkins talking about liberalism and econophysics. I have no idea what it's about, but we are going to discover it in 2 weeks. Now we have a reservation here at the restaurant for 25 people. So if you want to join us for the dinner, please feel free.
Nice.
Oh, and bye, and see you in... Sorry? No, it's not free.